Hello everyone, Brad from the PDH Pod here, and today I will be doing a deck tech for my absolute favorite commander in the entire Pauper Commander format, Minthara Merciless Soul. Minthara Merciless Soul is a 2/2 legendary elf cleric from Commander Legends Baldur's Gate that costs 2 generic, a white and a black, and her rules text says, Ward X, where X is the number of experience counters you have. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield, you get an experience counter. And creatures you control get +1/+0 for each experience counter you have. Like many Pauper commanders, Minthara can be built in myriad ways, but the direction that really spoke to me was to take more of a mid-range approach. In this video, I'm going to break down my deck as I have it in Moxfield by going through the various reasons why certain cards or suites of cards are in here and how they have performed for me. I'm also going to go over the pros of the deck and then follow it up with the biggest downsides I've come up against so far. First up, Minthara wants permanents you control to leave the battlefield, so let's start there. In Magic the Gathering, literally any permanent you control has at least some chance of leaving the battlefield, but we're trying to have agency over the when, the how, and the why they are doing such things. I have 24 ways to actively cause my permanents to leave the battlefield, but I'll just go over some of the all-stars here. Blood Fountain is an amazing piece of recursion that gives us a token to sacrifice to itself or another effect. Not only are we getting free cardboard from the Blood Fountain, but both the token it creates and the fountain itself are cheap, value-laden ways to gain experience. The fountain's ability to recur 2 creatures is definitely icing on this cake. Cloud Shift and Ephemerate. There isn't much that needs to be said about these 2 one-drop dynamos other than they can serve so many different roles in this deck. From protection to pseudo-combat tricks to gaining experience, these are 2 of the best mono-white flickers in the game, so let's try to abuse them. Thraben and Novice Inspector. We go from the best one-drop flickers in mono-white to the best one-drop creatures in mono-white. This inspecting duo provides early blockers and a bit of chip damage, but most importantly, they each come with a free clue token that can be sacrificed to draw a card and gain some experience. Not for nothing, this pair is also a prime flicker target. Mukotai Ambusher. Anytime you ninjutsu this lifelinking artifact creature into play, you are going to gain experience from returning a creature to hand, so that right there made it an attractive addition to the deck. Add to that its potential to gain you 3, 6, or even 20 life, and this rat becomes a staple in almost any Minthara deck. Angelic Purge. This card falls in a couple different categories in this deck. By being targeted removal, it also gains you some experience by making you sacrifice anything cheap or free that you have lying around. A 3-mana sorcery isn't ideal, but it's one of the best exile spells we have in these colors and one of the only ones that help you trigger your commander. The Sacrifice Squad. This misfit gang of group edicts are absolute staples in every Minthara deck in my opinion. Not only are they helping you keep your opponents low on creatures, they are ripe for a flicker, Fleshbag and Disciple are targets for Unearth, and they all trigger experience counters. Tithing Blade is a great artifact edict that can get you some XP plus some life gain and drain in the later turns. They're all slam dunks. Lastly, let's touch on Omen of the Sun. With Flicker of Fate, this is a repeatable token creator and life gainer, and many times those tokens aren't just 1/1s, sometimes they're 4/1s, sometimes they're 8/1s. Add in the fact that Omen has built-in sacrifice for scry ability, and you've got a solid value card that gains you some XP. Okay, so now we have a pile of experience counters. What now? Well, I'll tell you what now. With a total of 28 creatures, not counting all the tokens we can make, which potentially pushes us over the 40 creature mark, Minthara never seems to have a shortage of bodies to turn sideways. And honestly, it can get kind of ridiculous. In fact, let's start with the most ridiculous one of the entire bunch. Nested Shambler. This MH2 hero shows up in so many of my decks, but it's never more powerful than it is in a Minthara build. First off, it's a 1-drop threat, so it's easy to resolve at any point in the game, but where it shines is when you start gaining XP and this zombie turns into like, I don't know, a 5/1 that dies into 5 5/1 squirrel tokens. That is suddenly 25 extra damage on the board for doing nothing. 10 out of 10, would recommend. Speaking of dying into beaters, let's talk about Ministrant of Obligation. This 3-mana flyer was an amazing downshift to common and has since seen play in almost every white-based deck I own. First, it's got evasion and is a great unearthed target, and kinda like the Shambler, this cleric dies into 2 1/1 flying spirit tokens. Well, at minimum they're 1/1, more likely your opponents are staring down 2 flying 5/1s or whatever, I don't know, they're big. Bring it! Worms Crossing Patrol. This card has been hot and cold for me in about every deck in which I've tried it, but it performs well a little more often than not in this particular deck. Being able to have a 1 mana X1 that creates tokens of itself when it attacks is super powerful. You go from having a 1/1 for 1 to a 5/1 for 1 to having 3 5/1s for 1. Come on, man. Also, their Exile clause works splendidly with Minthara's experience trigger. For those latter reasons alone, I've been considering Tabaxi Toucaneers, but 5 mana, yeesh. Healer's Hawk and Battlefield Raptor. The TLDR, one is a flying lifelinker for 1, and one is a flying first striker for 1. You gain like 4 to 6 experience, and suddenly those birds are game enders. Pack it up. Spirited Companion and Dusk Legion Zealot. 2 mana cantrippers are at a premium in any white-based deck. These two are both amazing flicker targets, but can easily come down as 4/1s for just 2 mana. Usually these creatures only serve the purpose of drawing you a card and being suitable chump blockers, but when you can buff their power by 4 or more, they become legitimate threats. If unblockable creatures are more your jammy jam, then let's talk about Soltari Visionary. It's a 3 mana 2/2 with Shadow, which in PDH basically means it's going to connect every time, all the time. Similar to Mukotai Ninja from earlier, this is a nice way to ensure your opponents take at least 2 damage, but more than likely, they'll be taking 5 or 6 repeatedly. Being able to blow up an enchantment is honestly the main reason we're playing this card, because I mean, Pestilence, Inspiring Leader, Street Urchin, they exist. One more that I'd like to add into this group isn't a creature card, but a creature maker? Raise the Alarm. This spicy instant speed body creator lets you drop 2 1/1s at your opponent's instep for just 2 mana. They'll be ready to attack for massive amounts of damage as soon as you untap. We're already in a deck that wants to leave up some sort of mana for interaction, so having 2 open is not a big ask here. Speaking of interaction, what good mid-range pile would be complete without a whole slew of it? With 17 pieces of dedicated interaction and removal spells, we're likely to have 1 in hand at any given point in the game. Let's begin with the best. Snuff Out. We're running Swamps, so Snuff Out? Executioner's Capsule is a great way to suspend removal until you need it, plus being able to trigger some XP is a nice touch. Extract Confession is one of the most recent additions to the deck, and it slots right into the Sacrifice Squad. Being able to take out some chumps and the upside of nabbing your opponent's biggest creatures is a plus in my book. Pauper Commander and Destroy Evil. If you haven't drawn your Visionary throughout the game, or it got rudely destroyed by some mean jerk, either of these two work perfectly at destroying those pesky enchantments I mentioned earlier. Pauper Commander is especially nice because it will give you an experience counter. The worst case scenario is that it's a 3/1 body with flash. Nothing like dropping an 8/1 on your opponent's instep for 2 mana, am I right? One thing a lot of Orzhov decks struggle with is card draw, but I've built in a modest suite of card advantage spells that really try to focus on Minthara's ability. Village Rites and Deadly Dispute. Granted, we've had a handful of functional Village Rites reprints, but that doesn't make this effect any less staple-y in most Black X decks. I just have a personal preference for Village Rites here, mainly because of the Mystical Archives printing. This deck is quite mana hungry, so costing only 1 is also a huge upside. As we know, Deadly Dispute is the GOAT. It not only helps you trigger Minthara's experience by sacrificing a creature, but it also gives you a treasure token that can put another XP counter on the board for you later. Inspiring Overseer. The best card in New Capenna Limited is also one of the best creatures in any white deck. Being 3 mana makes it easy to cast on curve, it is super flickerable, and it's also a nice unearthed target. Relic of Progenitus. At 1 mana, you can't really go wrong here. It can help clean out your opponent's bin. It also draws a card and gains you an experience when you need it. All that in one nice, neat 1 mana package. Lastly, Commander's Sphere and Mind Stone. I don't love the idea of a 3 mana rock being in this deck, but being able to sacrifice it for free to draw a card and gain experience makes it worthy of a permanent spot. Until they print something better. Mind Stone is nice at 2 mana. Tapping for only colorless is a bit of a downside though, but sacrificing it to draw a card is almost always worth it, especially in a deck that wants things to leave the battlefield. Outside of those last 2, our ramp package is rounded out with Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, and Prismatic Lens, which is probably going to end up being swapped out for Star Compass because it generates colored mana. Before I get into a few reasons that the deck struggles, let's touch on the last suite of spells I have here, and that's Protection. Granted, the ward ability is a thing. It's a very hard thing for some of your opponents to deal with, but that isn't to say that there aren't times when we need to protect our commander or a giant flying creature. Stave Off. I feel like this 1-mana protection spell is a little underplayed. Not only will it protect any of your creatures from anything you want it to for the most part, it can often be used to fizzle an opponent's combo turn by giving their Firebrand Archer protection from blue or whatever other nonsense they're doing. Benevolent Bodyguard and Kamiya False Hope. These are both amazing pieces of protection. One is basically almost a stave off on a body, and the other is a nice fog. They can both be sacrificed for free, which makes them great at acquiring experience. Kami gets a little awkward because most of the time you're wanting to sacrifice it during an opponent's combat step, and that won't trigger Minthara, but it's literally a free XP counter on your turn anytime. Sign me up. Speaking of fogs, Prismatic Strands. Oh, yeah, that's it. Next card. Speaking of sort of fogs, Safe Passage is one of my favorite non-creature cards in this entire deck. It can absolutely act like a 3-mana fog if you're in the market for such things, but it also protects your board, but not everyone else's. So in the case of a giant alpha strike against the table, your side will be the one that lives. Also, it prevents all damage, not just combat damage to you and creatures you control. This means sweepers, this means pingers, this means all the damn damage. 3 mana is steep, and you've got to know ahead of time when you're willing to cast the card, but it's totally earned a spot in my heart and in this deck. Crypt Rats. I've included Crypt Rats here because I'm playing Swamps? LOL, really, I've included the rats in this protection category because it's kind of a break in case of emergency type card. You never want to activate this when you've got 80 power on your side that's spread out over a bunch of 1-butts. But go-wide tokens are a real thing in the current meta, and having a semi-cheap way to clean them up is handy in a deck that wants to take the game into the later turns. Also, like so many other cards in this deck, it's a nice target for Unearth. Okay, now for a couple cons about the deck before I sign off. No deck can be perfect, right? Even Orzhov. First up, simply by virtue of being Orzhov, this deck can be extremely slow. It's not totally uncommon to have gained 3+ experience by turn 6 and start bashing faces, but where this deck shines is in the much later turns, like turn 8 to turn 12-ish, if you live that long. You're not going to kill any one of your opponents by turn 5 or whatever, so just be aware that you're in it for the long haul. That's actually a very decent consideration if you're going to choose this deck for a tournament with timed rounds. Buyer beware. Second up, look at my creature base. Actually, look at the creature base for almost every Minthara deck on Moxfield, and you'll see that the majority of its creatures have 2 or less toughness. Those are just Orzhov problems, right? That means every Pestilence activation wipes your board. Every random pinger kills one of your 8 power tokens. There are a few ways to mitigate this, like Fortifying Provisions and Luma Threadfield, but only giving +1 to the collective butts just doesn't seem worth it at times. I mean, if your opponent is going to activate Pestilence once, they're probably going to activate it twice. However, I am considering cards like Mortician Beetle and Carrion Feeder that can grow big enough to get out of most Pestilence ranges, but we'll just have to see how that shakes out. I'm also considering just crossing my fingers and praying I don't run into sweepers, and that's probably a fine approach too. Final thoughts. Minthara can be a massive threat at just about any competitive table, but the deck is also uncomfortably easy to interact with. Anytime you sit down with it, you need to understand your opponent's decks and what they're trying to do, and you also need to understand and accept what your Minthara deck is weak to. Is there an opponent on a pinger deck? Are they a Pestilence deck? What do you think their combat steps will look like? Do you have interaction for that infinite combo in the command zone? And what, in the name of Christ, do you do against a Mayhem Devil deck? These are questions I don't want to ask. Regardless, you really need to prioritize playing to your outs. Your Angelic Purges, your Cathar Commandos, your Soltari Visionaries, your Fogs, your Flyers, your Edicts, etc. I love this deck because it's Orzhov, obviously, but also because it's packed to the rafters with not only potentially giant game-ending threats, but also some of the best answers we have in the format that are available in these colors. It's a pleasantly tactile deck that has very interesting play patterns and plays out a little bit differently every time you shuffle it up. In short, this is my all-time favorite Pauper Commander deck and is likely to stay that way, especially since I've been eyeing some spicy additions from Modern Horizons 3. Have I given you enough reasons to try a Minthara deck? Do you have a different version of this deck that you want me to see? Drop some comments below. I would love to see them. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great week. Peace.